Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's episode of Human Insights Unlocked. We are thrilled to have a true industry expert with us today, someone who has not only made waves in the field of market research, but has also shared his insights with the world through numerous platforms. Our guest today is Andrew Custage, a senior director and head of insights at Medallia. Andrew's journey in the world of market research has been nothing short of remarkable. He has not only served some of the big brands across various industries, including restaurants, retail, and consumer packaged goods, but he has also been at the forefront of delivering groundbreaking research and insights. He has also hosted over 100 webinars on industry trends and has been a go-to source for analysis and commentary in publications like the Wall Street Journey, CNBC, Forbes, and many more. Andrew, it's a true honor for me. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Today, you and I are going to talk about how we can to learn how to turn market research insights into business gold. Now, this topic might sound a little bit broad for people like us who are within the market research day in, day out. But what I noticed recently is I've been in this for 10 years and we communicate with researchers. Usually our stakeholders are people who are convinced in research. But is this a bubble and how big is the bubble? Are there still companies that need to be convinced that the insights are gold?
That's a great question. I think that a lot of companies have recognized or acknowledged in some form that we live in a very data-driven world now, and I think historically the main competition to market research wasn't other market research firms battling each other, but it was the idea of market research versus just intuition and gut feel, right? And just making decisions off of what somebody has a feeling is right for the business. I believe companies have become much more focused on data driven insights and incorporating data into their decision making. But I do feel that there are a lot of companies that can move further down in how sophisticated they are or the value that they get out of not only external panel market research, but also just using their own data and what they know about their own customers too.
This is great. Okay, well, usually among our audience, we have research experts, people who want to know more about the latest and greatest trends. But for today's episode, I really have my fingers crossed we reach to more stakeholders as well. Can you share from your expertise on the key role that market research insights play in driving business success?
Yeah, sure. So I think, I mean, obviously I'm biased because I work as a market researcher and my focus is on serving clients or the public with information on what's going on in industries, and I love to do that. I think for every brand, it's probably a little bit different of where exactly market research comes into play. But my view, at least on where it serves best, is when businesses begin with thinking about the levers that they can pull. They start by thinking about the actions they can take, but recognize that making those decisions, deciding what to do, is something that can't be done without being informed by data. So, my view, at least on where market research fits in best with driving business results and, as you say, business gold, is I think it starts with the business question of what action can we take, what strategy can we pursue, and what information do we not yet know that will help us decide which of those actions to take or to take an action at all. And I think crafting the research based on those questions and already having an understanding of what decision you're likely to make before you know what the data shows will help you get the best data, ask the right questions, interpret it the right way. I believe that that's usually a better approach than just coming at something with pure curiosity and saying, it would be very cool to know about X, Y, and Z, but you don't really have a thought of what you would do with that data once you get it, and it might be a lot of work that ultimately doesn't lead to action that way.
That is a great answer and leads me to the next question. Actually, you also touch based on that, that sometimes we do have data and we can dig for gold in that data, but also once we have the business question and we have collected the data, what are the fundamental steps one should take to gather and analyze market research data effectively?
Well, I think it probably comes down a lot to what data we're talking about, and I'm certainly by no means an expert on all of the many different types of market research data there's out there, and honestly, the list is growing every day, right? Like historically, so much of market research was done with survey-based research, whether it's broad, more quantitative surveys or smaller focus groups to get more of the qualitative, free response type of sentiment. We've moved on so much now in the past 15 plus years, and even in the past few years of how common it is to use other forms of data for market research. So I think the steps on bringing insight out of that vary dramatically, right? In some cases, you really just need much more of a sense of communication and telling the right story of what the data shows, but the data itself is maybe not that complicated. Maybe if it was a simple survey or something like that. But if we move on now and we look at some data sets where, I mean, we at Medallia on the market research side, and especially the company I came from that Medallia acquired, Sense 360, we work with panels that have several million consumers in them, and we track information like credit card and debit card transactions, smartphone location tracking, all of these types of data sets that have become much more common in market research over the past few years. You really need a much more thorough analytical mindset and a lot more horsepower behind the scenes to make use of that data. So, our process of how we curate the data and basically take it from raw form into usable metrics and then interpret those metrics from there. It's lengthy and it uses people a lot smarter than me that are able to really do the data science and the engineering and all the great stuff on the back end that makes that data usable. So, yeah, I mean, I guess to go back to your original question, I think it's becoming more common now to really need that much more technical skill set to make use of market research data, more so than the survey based approaches that have been around for longer.
Okay, that is that you're leading it in a great direction. So I want to ask you, you mentioned a lot of people much smarter than you, than me, maybe. Are there any tools and technologies that we can use that you recommend for not only collecting but organizing and analyzing market research data?
Ooh, we certainly use a variety of tools that I think at minimum the things that seem to be necessary these days are around some sort of dashboarding or business intelligence platform. I don't want to endorse one over the other or anything like that, but I think I it certainly depends on the type of thing you're doing. If it's a survey based approach, certainly there's going to need to be some sort of survey programming tool. You're going to need something that's going to have the ability to cross tabulate and apply weighting and other things to data before you analyze it. For other charts or especially bigger data sets that are more behavioral, like I mentioned, I think you need some sort of BI tool. But behind the scenes, as far as actually processing the data, it's really not my wheelhouse as much as it would be engineers and others. But I think certainly there is an arsenal of many different tools that go into the equation, and that's just talking about panel based market research. When you talk about other forms that I think fall within consumer insights, like voice of the customer, feedback collection from surveys following a visit or something like that, there's certainly a fantastic set of tools that can be used for that too. Not to endorse my own company, Medallia, in this, but we certainly are a leader in providing some of those technologies as well. But yeah, don't want to give you the sales pitch or anything like that.
No, no, no. We just want to be as helpful as possible. And when our viewers, our listeners jump on here, and if they're convinced now that insights are valuable for them to dig the gold in their business, maybe there will be people, but maybe there will be tools or a combination of tools and people that can help us, help them to get this business goal. So could you provide a real-world example of how turning market research insights into an actionable strategy led to significant business growth or success? You don't have to name an actual client. You can just say it was a big finance company or a telecom, just a real world example.
Yeah, of course. And of course, a lot of credit goes to my colleagues on a lot of these projects that we've been able to do for clients. A few that come to mind for me. A lot of our client base, at least in our earlier stages for Sense 360 before we were acquired by Medallia, a lot of our client base was focused on restaurant and retail. So some examples that come to mind for that. One thing that I think was really cool was during COVID, especially several months in around the fall of 2020, so maybe about 6 months or so after the pandemic began worldwide, a lot of restaurant brands had really experienced major shifts in their sales, right? Some of them declined very heavily, and it wasn't necessarily due to things that were their fault. It was just the way that the pandemic affected consumer behavior of people sheltering in place. So restaurants that had a very heavy dine-in presence where people would go to the restaurant historically and not really use it for delivery or drive-through or anything like that, they were obviously at a big disadvantage compared to, let's say, a much bigger quick service or fast casual restaurant that is much more accustomed to go orders or drive through or things like that that were more suitable during the pandemic when people didn't want to spend much time face to face with an employee when they were getting their food. So during that situation, a lot of restaurants, I think, were very anxious or worried about their sales performance, especially when they were seeing sales go down. And one of the coolest things that I think we were able to do with our data, especially because we can see the activity of so many consumers and their behavior across so many different restaurant brands, is we were able to categorize over 150 different brands, restaurant chains in the US, by their performance and look at various drivers and factors that helped explain that performance. And we were able to show how much of it was driven by factors or characteristics that the brands already had before the pandemic began. So, for instance, a lot of things had to do with geography. Brands that were in rural areas were doing better than ones in urban areas. And a lot of that had to do with lockdowns or how seriously people were taking the pandemic. There were other factors around how value focused they were versus how product quality focused they were. And a lot of people were very conservative with their money at certain parts of the pandemic because of concerns about wage loss or just the state of the economy. All of these factors added up and helped explain a very large proportion of why many brands were doing better than others. And it really helped put in context for several of our clients whether they should be taking action and trying to pivot in some form, or if their fate was essentially kind of sealed for them and there's not really a better strategy they could approach. If they modified anything, it might make things worse versus better. And I think it helped shape a lot of the thinking where otherwise they would have thought, hey, it sounds like some restaurants are doing very well and we're not doing so well. We have to change things rapidly. We need to change our product. We need to change our prices because somebody's doing better than us and there's a reason why. So having that context and that external understanding, I think, is something a lot of our clients would have never had without research and insight into the performance of their competitors and the characteristics of their competitors. And that was a really cool example of, I think, using data on a much bigger scale to help shape the thinking strategically for our clients. Of course, there are a lot of other things we've done for our clients too, of helping them decide on things like launching new products and what of them are going to have the most appeal to consumers, and things that they were running temporarily, like a limited time offer, let's say, and we were able to help convince them based on research of consumer appeal or consumer behavior that maybe this is something that should be offered permanently. And it's been cool to see that brands make those decisions and use market research as a necessary data point and to provide conviction and more evidence behind the decisions that they make.
Thank you so much. These were some very good examples, but I assume that in our experience, we also have examples of research insights that were not leveraged to their maximum. What are common mistakes or pitfalls that businesses should avoid when attempting to leverage market research insights?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think as somebody who works in this space and has worked with a bunch of clients over the course of years, it is always frustrating when I think you and the rest of the team put a lot of effort and thoroughness behind analysis, only to find that maybe it falls on deaf ears in some ways. And I'm sure everybody that's worked in the market research industry long enough has had an experience, whether they've served as a consultant or they were internally on a market research team for a brand, where the data suggests something, it provides guidance on an action to take, and then the action wasn't taken. And I think it's important as a starting point to recognize that it's not personal. It's not necessarily an indictment on the work in any way. But sometimes there's just much more to making a decision or the feasibility for a brand to act on something that goes beyond what the market research suggests be done alone. There's a lot around internal complexities for operations. There's a lot of financial considerations about profitability and risk in order to implement something. And I think it is important as market researchers to start and recognize that while market research provides a very important data point and contribution to the decision making process, it isn't the only thing that goes into making a decision by any means. So recognizing the role it plays and the role it doesn't play, I think, is really important for starters. Another thing, though, to go back to what I said earlier, is I do think the market research that has the best chance of being useful and is able to avoid pitfalls of falling nowhere and being not as useful. I do think it has to start with the design of research around the business question and knowing what the business can do versus just pure exploratory curiosity. So that's another pitfall that I do think sometimes occurs, is a very blanket, broad question that is not oriented back to something the business might really need or be able to do anything with. And it's just a broad exploratory exercise that probably isn't going to be used well. Some other things that I think are pitfalls too. Of course, I think trying to draw too strong of a conclusion over data that might have biases or flaws to it is a very important thing in our field as well. So maybe trying to draw a very broad and strong, convincing point over data that doesn't really have a very large sample size behind it, or it was asked in a manner that might introduce bias. For instance, asking the appeal of a new product, but you're only asking your most loyal and dedicated customers, and because maybe those are the ones you have access to. I think recognizing maybe these people are more enthusiastic about the new products your brand might launch than the average customer might be, or people who aren't your customers but you hope someday will be a customer. Recognizing that level of appeal, or just the answer choices that were picked and who actually picked them and whether they are representative of the whole population they're looking for. These are all things that come to mind to me right now, but it's something that certainly I think takes experience and years of doing enough projects to recognize where there might be biases or some things that are just ultimately not going to get you to the best possible conclusion or takeaway.
Thank you so much. I have a couple of follow-up questions here. First of all, I want to say that I really like your idea of compassion to the stakeholders. I have attended a lot of conferences, and I keep hearing about this clash between the research teams and the actual stakeholders, and why insights are not acted upon. And a lot of time, people from the research background, they say that the people are not convinced about the results. But you are giving a different perspective, a perspective that is saying, "Hey, guys, the market research insights is not the only data point they have on their desk when they have to make a business decision whether to go or no go with a product, for example." That is a great one. My question here is, do you believe that better communication between stakeholders and researchers, whether that's going to be an agency or an internal research team, regardless, can help in delivering insights reports that actually take in consideration the other stakes on the stakeholders table?
That's a great question. I think that one of the things that helps you get there better, at least, is having a more embedded or dedicated presence between an agency or a consultancy that's involved in the research with the companies that they're serving. I think oftentimes, and maybe too often, firms will hire market research for vendors for a one-off exercise. It's, let's say one single point in time, one study about one topic, and the work might be excellent, but I think there hasn't yet been that trust that's been built between the teams, or uh, the market research team, I think, might be coming in externally with not enough familiarity of the interworkings of the client. Who the decision makers are, what are the feasibility challenges that are going to help shape a recommendation. All of those things I think lead to better choices, and they come in the form of a more regular relationship. Maybe it's a more subscription based or permanent retainer of different projects or things like that. Maybe it's refreshing the same study over again multiple times and focusing on how things have changed. But I personally think that there's more integration and a better chance of a union between market research stakeholders and the rest of the organization that has their own perspective too. I think when there's a longer term series of projects as opposed to just a simple one off and then the team walks away and remains uninvolved from that point forward.
I wonder how do you differentiate between valuable insights and noise in the data, and what advice can you give to our listeners in this regards?
It's a very tough thing, I think, to always get right. At minimum, I think you need to start with understanding data that meets statistical thresholds of significance and things like this, right? So, of course, there are statistical approaches based on sample size and variance and all these things where that at least if there is a difference in results by comparing things to one another, that is due to more than just random chance. So, meaningfulness versus noise in the data, I think, of course, starts from there, but it's not the only thing. Like, for instance, if a business made $1,000 in one day in real life and then they made $1,001 the next day, that's the truth. It's not a statistical problem that has to do with sampling. So that's not something that was due to randomness. They did truly, in fact, make one more dollar the next day than the day before. But is that noise or is that meaningfulness? Should we draw the conclusion that the business has improved in some way because they made one more dollar than they did the day before? Probably not, right? That's probably still just due to some sort of randomness or things that are outside of truly the control of the business that led to that outcome. So I think when we think about meaningfulness versus just noise in the data, I think that there are other approaches, but again, it really depends on the data set or the question being asked. But I think some other things to look at would be to understand how much of a difference or movement that occurred in this case compares to how often it occurs normally. So, like, for instance, if things move up or down by 3% regularly, maybe it is statistically significant that there was a movement of 3% this most recent time or 4% this most recent time, but that might not be an indicator of things to come. It might not be that the brand is permanently up and it's, this is something to attribute to an initiative that they ran and we really can prove causation here. It may be that this is just the normal variability and cycles that can't fully be explained by the data we have, but we shouldn't over attribute, a potential cause based on that alone. That's far different than to say, this movement is typically in the range of 3% over the course of time, up or down, but it just moved up 25% now in the past week. That is likely far more meaningful. So I think that historical context is important, even if movements that, they meet the bar of statistical significance or something like that, but they still fall within a typical pattern that, isn't anything to write home about. I think certainly that's one way to think about it. I think, of course, there's other approaches too to try and really get to cause versus just correlation, and making sure you've factored in the right variables, you've controlled for the right things. There might not ever be a complete silver bullet, but I think at least these are some of the ways I think about it on trying to not over attribute or make too big a deal out of things that actually are probably not anything that major, and they're going to revert back to their normal values anyway. And they in that case, I would just call them noise, or I'd be more likely to, I guess.
I do agree. I do agree. And going back to your previous point about the relationship with the clients, with the stakeholders, where you have some sort of a long-term relationship opposed to ad hoc work, I guess that this can help the researchers recognize the noise and follow for actual patterns that are in the behavior, correct?
Absolutely. And I think knowing context to for having more experience working directly with a brand and understanding their industry better. Like, for instance, I think noise, another point I probably should have made earlier, is I think noise or meaningfulness, or whether to focus on how precise numbers need to be. I think it does vary by industry and the maturity of the industry too. So, like, for instance, there are certain retailers, or maybe utilities companies. There are bigger, mature industries that have been around longer, and maybe ordinarily it would be very rare to expect that a department or a store, or you name it, would have experienced a shift in their sales that's more than 3 or 4% up or down in a given year. That might be far different than an emerging technology or some other type of market where maybe the growth rate has historically been 50 or 60% or well over 100% per year. And, it is noise to say that in the past week, the year over year growth rate was 76% versus 71%. Like, that might not be as consequential, or it might be more reflective of just being kind of noise or something that's not worth making a big deal out of, versus a brand who it would be very surprising if their sales were 6% year over year as opposed to 1% or 2% year over year.
Completely agree. Completely agree. Okay, so going back to the customers and the way you build the relationship with them, it's we already know that it's important to have a long-term relationship so we can have better, sharper insights that are aligned with their as is scenario as well as the actual business question they have. But what are some best practices for effective communication of the market research insights to the key decision makers within a business? Now that we have them, now that we have established this long-term relationship, we should communicate them so actions are taken.
I think an approach that we implement, at least here, and I think in many ways works well, is a regular set of touch points with our clients. So it depends on what the client preferences are, but in some cases it might be once every 2 weeks, it might be once a month. Uh, I think no matter what, having that regular check in process to understand new research needs that might be emerging, or how previous deliverables are being circulated and how they're being used. I think that regular check in session and touch points with the team is a very good practice that I'm very impressed with how our client engagement team and our analytics teams that serve clients, the relationship that many of them have had for multiple years with the same client counterpart, and over the course of those touch-ins, I mean, it's probably been they've been in well over 100 meetings together, or something like that by this point, which is certainly something to be said about building rapport and trust. Um, I think also a balance of custom insights with bringing to the table something that might be more public or syndicated, or more of kind of like an industry report, is a really good balance too. So the custom questions, I think, are going to get to the heart of what the brand cares about most in the moment, and the research is going to be designed around their particular business questions. But I think oftentimes there's inspiration that comes from an asset that was created not with any one client in mind, but it's something that's going to be useful to everyone. It might be a perspective on an emerging trend that is affecting an entire industry, or something else that I think it might spark inspiration and also just showcase some of the capabilities of the research that a brand might not have always seen if the only thing they were exposed to up until that point is just custom work only, and not anything more broad than that.
Mhm. And speaking of emerging trends, are there any emerging trends or changes in the field of market research that our audience should be aware of? And how might this impact their strategies for turning insights into business success?
Well, I think there's a lot going on right now with the use of more automated or generative insights. Certainly, I think a lot of people are now logging into Chat GPT to try and find answers and things like that. And I do think it's important for market researchers to have an eye towards how AI might be a very useful tool going forward, and in many cases already has been a useful tool for many companies, as far as being able to distill insights much more rapidly and without as much subjectivity. There's certainly a long way to go in that, I think, but having an eye and a priority and a roadmap around how those insights can be delivered in much more automated fashion, I think, is a big focus. I mentioned before, of course, it's a big focus within the work that we do, but using data sets beyond just survey alone, and using much larger scale behavior based data sets, I think, is a very big trend focus too. So understanding how users behave based on, following their web experience, following how they view content, of course, um, following their actual spend, where their dollars are going, following where they physically move. Of course, I think doing this in a responsible manner with the right consent and opt-ins, and an eye towards data privacy is very important, and it's something that we certainly take seriously. But the idea around just using more data sets beyond survey alone, I think, is a very big focus, and much more automated and data driven insights, I think, is the big key thing too.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, one final question to close this. What actionable tips or advice can you provide our listeners to help them turn market research insights into business gold immediately or as fast as possible?
I wish I had a new, like, fresh take on something beyond what we've already talked about, but credit to the questions that you've asked already. I apologize if I might repeat myself a little bit, but I am, again, really a big believer in the idea of understanding what business questions and what levers and actions a brand can actually take as a starting point, and knowing how data is going to inform that decision one way or the other before you collect it. And I think that approach, and understanding that market research is a necessary input in order to make those business decisions, is really the key, as opposed to just a broad, exploratory, curious question that it's very unclear how the business would ever act on the information, even if they did have it. So yeah, I mean, I personally am a bigger believer in that from a market research perspective, but there is value in always keeping a pulse on things, even if you don't have a business question in mind too. So it takes the combination of both, but certainly don't forget about the first one of those two, at least.
Well, thank you for the advice, Andrew. I hope that our audience will also take it. And I do believe that this conversation was helpful and interesting. It was a real honor having you here with us today, and hope to see you in our podcast again in future.
Thank you, Stefka, so much for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity.